This is my unheated, planted White Cloud Mountain Minnow tank which runs entirely at room temperature year-round without the need of a heater. In winter, the room temperature dips to around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and in summer it peaks at around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. With energy prices being what they are right now, I do think that tanks like this are going to become even more popular within the hobby, as it helps remove the energy cost for your heater, which is often the main expense for fish keeping. Now that the tank has reached its 1-year-old mark, I thought it would be a good time to share the setup, how this tank's evolved over the past year, reflect on the journey and share some of my lessons learned, and go over the plans for the future of the tank. So starting with the tank build, and I know prices have skyrocketed over the last year, but when I originally set this up, everything was fairly affordable, at least by UK standards. I went with a 45 litre or 12 US gallon tank, but in hindsight I really wish that I'd went for the 54 litre or 14 US gallon option, because it's really not that much of a price increase. The White Cloud Mountain Minnows in this tank are far more active than I ever expected them to be, and I do think that little bit of extra space would have went a long way. To improve the aesthetics, I added some cheap window privacy film that I got off Amazon to the back of the tank, and while this is optional, I really do think it helps with these junglescape setups. The hardscape and some of the initial epiphyte plants like the Anubias coinleaf and Anubias Petite were actually intended for a different tank, but I ended up repurposing them for this one. While I do like the look, I've since moved towards minimalist hardscape designs in my tanks, and I plan to stick on the minimalist side of it moving forward, so there's more swim space for fish and more planting space for plants. When placing the hardscape, I positioned it in the tank first and then added the substrate around it to bury parts of it. This not only helps reduce the amount of substrate needed for the tank because the hardscape takes up a lot of volume, keeping costs down, but I also like the look of rocks when they are emerging out of the substrate rather than resting on it. Speaking of substrate, I went with the regular Fluval Stratum, and it is still relatively affordable as far as aquasoils go here in the UK, but I know over in the United States it can be far more expensive. Personally, I do think that Fluval Stratum is a good option for low-tech aquarium setups. This is a natural product, so there is already some nutrients in the soil and clay that's used in the formula, but it's not enhanced by soaking it in nutrient solutions like some of the more expensive aquasoils on the market. But thanks to the clay content in the product, it also has a higher than average cation exchange capacity, meaning it can absorb nutrients from the water column and store them in a form accessible for plant roots. So I like to think of it as kind of like a rechargeable battery, because the fish waste gets broken down by microorganisms and releases the nutrients into the water column for plants to absorb directly, but the Fluval Stratum also absorbs and holds it for plant roots to use too. At this point I added a little bit of water to make planting easier, but this step is optional, but I highly recommend it. Next, I added the rocks to the tank, and these were sold to me as Sirius stone, but I'm pretty sure it's actually some kind of other limestone based rock. These just don't look right to be actual Sirius stone or one of the close clones of it, but thankfully they haven't caused any major problems with water parameters, so it's not a major problem. Then I mounted 3 Anubias caladifolia plants to the hardscape, and this plant is amazing for smaller tanks like this because it doesn't grow too big, but it still has a decent sized leaf on it for hiding spots for your fish. Even though the Anubias barteri species is native to Africa, it handles colder temperatures very well, and I had it in several room temperature tanks over the winter without issue. In the back right of the tank, I also added some narrowleaf Java fern to the driftwood using aquarium safe glue. In hindsight, I really wouldn't recommend this type of plant for an unheated setup because it quickly started to struggle in the tank and eventually had to be removed because it was just melting away. Then I broke up an in vitro cup of Bucephalandra Kedagang into smaller plantlets and glued them in different places across the hardscape. Even though this is native to the tropical rainforests of Borneo, this does very well in my room temperature tanks, and it's easily one of the best performing plants I have for cold setups. It also stays relatively compact, it grows slowly so there's very little maintenance for it, and it does have some unique colours on it, adding some colour pops to the tank too. Then came some Anubias Nana Petite, specifically the one from the Stoffels plant nursery, and I wish this was easier to find in my area because it's a great little plant. In my experience, it stays smaller than the regular Anubias Petite and it doesn't need any trimming because it maxes out at a very small size, making it perfect for nano tanks and adding pops of colour to your hardscape. Like the other Anubias varieties, I just glued it to the hardscape using aquarium safe glue. For the foreground, I added some Helanthium green into the substrate, and over the past year this plant has quickly grown on me. I personally have it in several low-tech tanks and consider it to be one of, if not the best, low-tech friendly carpeting plant in the hobby right now. Not only is it very easy to grow, but it doesn't need CO2 or fertilizers either. It also handles low light very well and keeps growing, and unlike something like Dwarf Sag that has a variable maximum height depending on lighting, Helanthium green is a lot more predictable, staying small. It is a stall-on plant, which means it starts to send out runners once it's established, so it will passively increase its plant mass in the foreground of the tank and eventually fill out and form a lush carpet. Originally, I did want this plant to act as a spawning area for my female white clouds to scatter their eggs, but let's just say that didn't quite go to plan. After that, I added some Hygrophilocorium Siamensis 53B, and although this is a tropical plant, it's done reasonably well in this tank. I also added some Limnophilus flora to the back left of the tank, and while this plant thrives in my heated setups, I wouldn't actually recommend it for an unheated tank. With all of the plants in place, I covered the substrate with a small piece of tissue to soften the impact of the water when filling the tank. This isn't as important as it can be in a capped dirt setup, but it is still helpful. These days I have switched over to small pieces of plastic instead to absorb the force of the water, because tissue can break up and then you've got to fish it out of your tank. For the water supply, I'm just using regular tap water, and mine has a pH of 6.4, a GH of 4 and a KH of 3, but I do add some tap water conditioner to neutralise chlorine, chloramines and heavy metals. Moving on to the tank accessories, and this tank is using a Haiger HG76 light. It's been a solid performer overall, but we are getting close to the time of year when the brands release their 2026 lights onto the market, so I am curious what Haiger release. I did get a sneak peek at the specs of two upcoming Ciora lights that'll be out over the next few months, and they blow the current models at their price point out of the water, so I'm curious how Haiger and Nicrew respond. I leave a link in the description to my regularly updated article covering the latest accessories I use in my fish room and recommend, so I can update it as newer lights are released onto the market. For filtration, I'm using an All Pond Solutions hang-on-back filter, and this is the same model that's sold under the Sun branding in other countries. It's done an excellent job overall, but the surface skimmer can be a little finicky, but since the cycle completed, this tank has had no problems with water parameters. Just like all of my hang-on-backs, I don't use the included cartridge system. Instead, I cut some 30 ppi foam down to size using the included cartridge as a size template, and I use that for my biological media, and then I'll cut a small cut out of filter floss to use as mechanical media. Although it does take around a minute to cut things down to size, overall it works out considerably cheaper than keep replacing these filter media cartridges. So moving on to actually cycling the tank, and in hindsight I did make a big mistake here, and I've changed my process for my future tanks. I chose to go with a fishless but plant-in cycle and use the Dr. Tim's ammonia solution to simulate a bioload, helping the necessary microorganisms develop to a size to process toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite before adding any fish, so they'd be safe from the start. I also added a few drops of all-in-one liquid fertilizer to the tank because there's a lot of epiphyte plants in here which feed directly from the water column rather than from the substrate. This is what the tank looked like at week 1, and as you can see there is a bit of algae forming on the plants, but it wasn't really that bad at this point. By week 2, algae was becoming more noticeable, and since this was a planted cycle, I did have to keep the light on to support plant growth, which does let algae grow in the uncertain times during a cycle where different nutrient levels spike up. I did stay on top of topping up water levels to counter evaporation, and I also kept dosing ammonia as it began to be used up by the microorganisms forming in the tank just to keep the nitrogen cycle going. Unfortunately, the high ammonia levels did start to take their toll on some of the in vitro cup plants in the tank because these tend to be more sensitive than the planted potted varieties. This is one of the main reasons I've since switched over to using the dark start method for my aquasoil based tanks like this one, and I link to my article in the description going over it in more detail and step-by-step processes of how you can do it if you are curious. But with the dark start method, it is a plantless and fishless cycle, and you basically use the ammonia solution to simulate a bioload and then add the living things once the cycle is completed to keep your plants healthy too, because some of them can melt. By week 3, this is what the tank looked like, and the algae was really starting to take over, and some of the other Anubias plants were starting to melt as well and needed to be removed due to them failing. This is another reason I switched to the dark start method, because with no plants in the tank you can leave your tank light off while the cycle is going, so there's very little algae generated. The Helanthium Tenellum green was also starting to melt, but this can be normal for this specific plant. I just think it melts its out of water leaves because they're not efficient for submerged life, and then it starts to regrow new submerged form leaves which are a little bit shorter than the emerged version. On day 25, I decided to add a few pink ram's horn snails to try and get the algae under control. These little guys have evolved in swamps over in Florida, and they can withstand higher ammonia and nitrite levels than other snails because of their natural environments. This can let you use the snail in-cycling method, which I've tried in a few tanks as well, but in hindsight, adding these guys to the tank was a mistake in my opinion. If I could rewind time, I would have waited until the cycle was fully completed and then added a few neurite snails instead of ram's horns, or potentially just added more Armano shrimp instead. This is because ram's horn snails can produce in freshwater tanks, and I use the fish poop fertilization method in my tank, so I add a little bit of extra food for the shrimp and snails to generate excess nutrients via their waste, and it doesn't take long for that extra food to be put to use and generate a small army of ram's horn snails. After adding the snails, I did test the water and get confirmation that the cycle was actually completed anyway, because the tank could take a full dose of 2 ppm of Dr. Tim's ammonia solution, and the microorganisms inside of it could cycle that down to undetectable levels of ammonia and nitrite within 24 hours. So moving on to month 2, which was a few days later, and I decided to bring in a little bit more help to try and get the algae under control as quickly as possible. I netted up 4 Armano shrimp from one of my other tanks and moved them into this one because they are one of the best algae eaters I've ever tried. Unlike some other species of shrimp from the Caridina genus, Armano shrimp are quite hardy and have very similar parameters to Neocaridina shrimp, making it easy to keep both of them together. Although I haven't seen all 4 Armano shrimp together for a long time, I do often see 3 of them together when I add food to the tank for them to snack on, so at least 3 of them are still in here. I also decided to add some yellow Neocaridina shrimp from one of my other tanks too. These little guys are very underrated when it comes to dealing with soft algae types in aquariums, and their bright coloration also contrasts well on aquasoil and really makes them catch the eye. As you can see in these initial clips from a year ago, their coloration of this specific colony looked amazing as well, and there was plenty of pigmentation on the shrimp. Once the algae in the tank did start to normalise because of all these little hungry mouths eating it, I do start to target feed my invertebrates with different food types just to enhance their diet and keep them healthy. Once again though, I just want to point out that all of this algae and a lot of the plant melt in the tank could have been completely avoided by simply going with the dark start cycling method from the start, and I've linked to my article going over that method in the description if you want to check it out. Then I introduced 8 golden White Cloud Mountain Minnows to the tank. These little guys do look a little bit washed out in this footage, but it's just because of the stress from being transported from Horizon Aquatics where I bought them, which is around 40 minutes from my home to my home, and then getting them in the tank. It is important to note that I did research all 4 inhabitants for this tank, and I knew that the snails, both species of shrimp, and the fish would be fine at the temperatures in my home even during the winter months without a heater. It really didn't take long for the minnows to adjust, and within about half an hour they were quickly out and about exploring their new home and getting used to things. According to my notes, it only took around 10 days from the time I added the Amano shrimp and Neocaridina shrimp for them to eat all of the visible algae in the tank. Moving on to month 3, and the White Cloud Mountain Minnows had fully coloured up by this point, and I absolutely love how these guys look. I use my phone camera to record them, and I honestly don't think it does them justice. These guys really do look great. The yellow Neocaridina shrimp had also fully settled into their new home too, but this clip does highlight something interesting with the rock, because like I mentioned earlier, it just doesn't look like Sirius stone to my eye, and I do think it's something else. As you can see though, the algae-eating crew really had done an excellent job of bringing the algae under control in this tank, and I didn't have to do anything extra. I just left them to eat it all. I am pretty sure I ended up with 6 male white clouds and 2 females, but that didn't stop them from breeding, and within the first few weeks it was constantly spawning in the tank. Around this time I also added some duckweed and water lettuce to the surface of the aquarium. I also decided to remove the Limnophila sessiliflora due to the amount of maintenance it needed and it not being required in this tank, and replaced it with some Dwarf Sag, which thankfully hasn't taken over. The Helanthium Tenellum green had also recovered nicely from the early melt it experienced, and the older immersed leaves had been broken down and eaten by the shrimp and snails and waste-eating bacteria. The plant itself was looking really healthy by this point as well, and I loved the look of the tank with the water lettuce roots on the surface hanging down, creating that jungle vine aesthetic look. Another benefit of the water lettuce roots was that they started to add more hiding spots for any baby White Cloud Mountain Minnow tanks hatching in the tank so they could avoid being eaten by their parents. Overall, I was happy with how the tank was progressing at this point, but it is important to keep in mind that this was only November, and while things were starting to cool down, we weren't actually in the winter months yet. That said, the White Cloud Mountain Minnows were constantly breeding, and I mean literally every single day they'd be spawning, and they seemed to follow a daily cycle of egg scattering in the morning, sparring between the males in the afternoon, and then breeding during the evening. So with all that going on, it really didn't take long before I started to see baby fry in the tank swimming around. According to my notes, I gave 8 baby white clouds to one of my friends who's mainly on the breeding side of the hobby, but he's told me he thinks that I've gave him at least 15 across 3 different batches of fry. I wasn't doing anything special to encourage breeding behaviour or maximise the survival of the fry in this tank either, but there were still constantly little babies appearing in the tank. This clip is a great example of how high-grade yellow Neocaridina shrimp look against dark aqua soil, and I honestly love this contrasting colour. The ram's horn snail population was still quite low at this point, but they do lay eggs that need to develop over a couple of weeks, so there is a slight delay before they start to show their true population. You can also see some new growth on the Hygrophila Siamensis 53B, which is a nice sign of recovery because it did have some minor issues during the cycle. But this is what the tank looked like at the end of month 3, and I was really happy with how things were going. Skipping over month 4 because it was December and I didn't really record much with Christmas and stuff like that, I was just hanging out with family and friends. So we'll get straight into month 5, which was early winter, and by this point the temperatures were starting to dip down to around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was taking a noticeable effect on the tank. While the fish, shrimp and snails were all absolutely fine, I did think that dormancy was starting to set in on a lot of the plants. Think of dormancy as a type of hibernation for plants where they basically stop growing or doing anything during the winter months, and then once things warm up they'll start to grow again. That said, the duckweed and water lettuce did continue to grow, although it was at a slow pace all the way through the winter months. Even with their slow growth rate, they still help to play a role in helping to maintain safe and stable water parameters in the tank through the winter. One thing worth mentioning is that nitrite spikes can be more common during the winter because some of the beneficial bacteria strains used to hold the cycle can struggle to perform correctly below 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. But despite the drop in water temperature, the water parameters for this tank stayed stable all the way through the winter, and I've never had any real issues since the cycle completed. One thing I did think was interesting is that the White Cloud Mountain Minnows were consistently breeding all the way through the colder winter months. Even though we can drop below freezing outdoors here in the UK during winter, this is an indoor tank with modern insulation in the house walls keeping things nice and warm, so even at around 18 degrees Celsius I do think that this is around the breeding temperatures white clouds prefer. One thing that was definitely becoming more noticeable this month is that the narrow-leaf Java fern in the back right of the corner was starting to melt back and show a lot of browning on the leaves. I do think that this is a combination of the colder water temperatures and potentially a lack of potassium in the water column because I don't dose liquid fertilizers, but the Hygrophila Siamensis 53B and the Helanthium Tenellum green also entered dormancy through the winter, but they didn't melt all the way back like the Java fern. But I didn't want to remove the Java fern as a lot of the fry in the tank were using it as a kind of nursery area so the babies could dart away if the adults came close to them, and because it was in the back right corner it also let me feed the fry very easily without the adults stealing their food. Now I did keep giving the white cloud fry to my friend so he could increase his colony size, but at some point I did decide to keep 2 of them for myself. Definitely month 5 was also when I lost my first White Cloud Mountain Minnow in the tank, and I don't think it's due to illness or infection or anything like that. Tiny Menagerie mentions in her care guide that white clouds can be very inquisitive and inspect the hardscape in their tanks and sometimes get trapped. I found one of my female white clouds wedged head first in the gap between the driftwood and the rock, and I do think she went in there voluntarily exploring rather than passing away somewhere else in the tank and then the Armano shrimp dragging her in there. It was around this time when I also noticed the first batch of baby ram's horn snails in the tank too, and although they're tiny they can grow at a rapid pace. But this is what the tank was looking like at the end of month 5, and again I was still relatively happy with how things are going even though the Java fern was starting to melt. Skipping over month 6 because I really didn't do much with the tank and getting straight into month 7. Things were slowly starting to warm up again, and I guess the tank was hovering around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit at this time, which is still just below the threshold for dormancy in some plants. But you could definitely see the effects of that because the narrow-leaf Java fern was looking even worse by this point due to a lack of warm water in the tank, and the Hygrophila Siamensis 53B was also looking rough. That said, the majority of the other plants, including the Anubias, Bucephalandra, Dwarf Sag, duckweed, Helanthium Tenellum green and water lettuce all made it through the winter, colder months without issue. By this point the pink ram's horn snail population had really started to take off in the tank. Multiple clutches of eggs had started to hatch at this point too, and they were definitely making themselves at home. One good thing to see was that the Helanthium Tenellum green had started to come out of dormancy and start to throw out its little stolon runners so it could spread and start to carpet the tank. This is what the tank was looking like at the end of month 7, and again for the most part I'm really happy with how things were going. The only real thing to report for month 8 was that the narrow-leaf Java fern was in full-blown decay mode and all of the leaves were brown and decomposing, so I decided to remove it just to prevent any problems in the tank with ammonia spikes or anything like that. Nothing really happened in month 9 either, so I'm going to skip that one and get straight into month 10, which was June, and things were starting to come back to life because water temperatures were starting to increase at a decent pace. By this point the water temperature had increased to a level where all of the plants were out of dormancy and starting to show signs of growth again. There was fresh growth on the Hygrophila Siamensis 53B, confirming that it had made it through the winter. It hadn't melted away, it just needed those warmer water temperatures to come back around. Unfortunately, I did lose a second White Cloud Mountain Minnow at this time, and there was no signs of infection or anything like that. It wasn't wedged into hardscape, so I just think it was one of those things. Another downside was that the ram's horn snail population had absolutely exploded as things started to get warmer in the tank. You can really see how it was starting to get out of control at this stage of the build, and I have the same issue in some of my other tanks too. The open space on the driftwood in the back right of the tank where the Java fern was starting to annoy me too, so I decided to order an Anubias Nana and place it here, and by chance it's the largest Anubias Nana I've ever seen. It's absolutely huge. I also had some leftover Cryptocoryne X Willisii from another tank that I decided to add to this one just to see how it would do without a heater in the tank. I know it looks massive in this clip, but that's its immersed out of water form. In its submerged form, the leaves and stems are far smaller, and I'm not even sure if it'll work in this tank because my Cryptocoryne in another room temperature tank failed during the winter. This clip is a good example of how plant dormancy can affect some species, as the Hygrophila 53B shows a clear contrast between the smaller fresh leaves that have grown on the plant compared to the older lower leaves that have got holes in them. In the midground of this clip you can see one of the two baby White Cloud Mountain Minnow fry that I decided to keep. Unfortunately, I don't think the other ones made it because it's been months since I've seen both of them at the same time to confirm both are still alive. And finally, the Helanthium Tenellum green had started to make some decent progress in starting to carpet the foreground of the tank. So skipping month 11 because again very little happened that month, so that brings us up to today. Now we are in the middle of the British summer, and on hot days the tank temperature can peak at around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. According to Maidenhead Aquatics, this is just at the upper end of White Cloud Mountain Minnow's water temperature tolerance ranges. But I have seen some other sources which say that it's quite a bit above their water temperature tolerances, but I haven't seen any real problems with the white clouds in my tank. This is what the tank is looking like right now, and other than the ram's horn snail population, I'm actually really happy with how things are going for the most part. I am considering getting an assassin snail later this week or trying out the lettuce leaf trick that I've seen some people on TikTok use. Basically, you get a lettuce, peel a leaf off, float it on the surface of your tank and let the snails swarm it and start eating it, letting you get them all in one place, and then you just remove the lettuce leaf, then repeat it over and over and over again. One thing that I do think's hilarious in this tank is that there's definitely one alpha male White Cloud Mountain Minnow who takes his role very seriously, but unfortunately he's definitely not the most intelligent. He aggressively defends the front section of the tank and chases all of the other males to the back, but for some reason once he's defeated all of the other males, he then decides to chase the female away too. So with what I think is the only female in the tank being in the back with the non-dominant males, that's where all of the breeding happens, while the alpha male proudly guards the front of the tank all alone. The surviving fry that I kept in this tank has grown a lot over the last few weeks, but the ones I gave to my friend are adults already, but he does use a heater in his tank and I do think that helps with their growth rate. There is a potential downside of that from what I've read though, because the warmer water from the heater does increase metabolism and let the fish grow quicker, but it also means they generally don't live as long either. I really don't think I'm going to get any more fry in this particular setup with the snail count currently what it is, because they just go over the scattering area where the female leaves her eggs and just eats them all. Another thing I've noticed is that some of the Anubias plants in this tank have flowered recently, which is interesting. The snails did eat one of the flowers unfortunately, but you can still kind of see the other one. I also have Anubias flowering in one of my other room temperature tanks too that has a winter period with colder water. So that does make me wonder if seasonal temperature swings does play a role in getting your Anubias to flower, because I've got Anubias in a lot of tropical temperature tanks and they just never flower in there. The Helanthium Tenellum green is doing a great job now and I'm really happy with the amount of growth it's had, but I do think it would have carpeted all of this area months ago if I had a heater in the tank. A few months back I did decide to remove the duckweed and water lettuce to improve light penetration as well, so it's easier to see the fish and when they're swimming around and get all of the colours. Now I know that a lot of people say that White Cloud Mountain Minnows are underrated fish, but I completely agree with them. They are one of my favourite fish to watch in my fish room. I'm actually considering getting another tank to set up in a similar way, which will be room temperature, and actually get the regular White Cloud Mountain Minnows for that tank. Although the Hygrophila 53B has bounced back and is grown again, I do think I will remove this in a month or two and try Lobelia cardinalis in its place instead. The Lobelia is native as far north as Canada, so I am curious to see if it can make it through the winter without going into dormancy. And finally, the Dwarf Sagittaria has started to grow at a slightly faster pace, but it hasn't taken over yet, but I might remove this too because it's absolutely dominating one of my other tanks. I just want to quickly round things off by going over my plans for the future for this tank, but for the most part I'm actually really happy with how it is right now. As I mentioned back at the start of the video, in hindsight I would have went with the 54 litre or 14 US gallon tank just to give the white clouds that extra bit of room because they are active swimming fish. I am currently toying with the idea of setting up a new cold water tank only rack with white clouds and Medaka in those tanks because I love both species, they are great little fish. This would let me buy 2 new 54 litre or 14 gallon tanks for that rack so I can put my gold white clouds out of this tank into one of those for the extra swim space and get regular white clouds in the other one and then put some Medaka rice fish in here. But that one is in the early planning stages, so for now the white clouds are staying in this tank. If I can get the ram's horn snail population under control in here too, I have no problems keeping this going because I actually really like the way it's looking, and hopefully the Lobelia cardinalis will better fill out the middle section of the tank. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful, thanks for watching and good luck with your cold water aquarium tanks.